Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, our two guests examine the question of whether the libertarian right and progressive left can join forces to break the alliance between our entrenched political parties and too-big-to-fail corporate interests. Brink Lindsay from the Cato Institute joins us for the second half of our show, but right now we have the indefatigable Ralph Nader on the phone to discuss his new book, Unstoppable, The Emerging Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State. Ralph, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Ralph, we live in a country whose founders detested what they call faction, and yet we're ruled by what appears to be a permanent political duopoly. Can you reflect on that a bit?
Yeah, I think it is a kind of duopoly that brooks no competition. I don't think there's any Western country that has so many obstacles to third-party or independent candidate challenges. It's a little easier for third-party independent in some smaller towns around the country. But at the state and federal level, no other country comes close to ballot access obstacles, all the petitions and how they disqualify the names and harass you. They don't come close to excluding third-party candidates, independent candidates from debates. And, of course, the money's overpowering on behalf of the two major parties. And then, of course, they gerrymander the district. And so in 90% of the House of Representative districts, there's just one essential party.
It's not competitive, right. Given all that, do you think we'll ever see the rise of a third party that can win seats in Congress?
Yeah, I think so. It's going to come in a way that maybe some people don't like. And it's going to come from some enlightened billionaires throwing their hat in the ring. But Ross Perot turned it into a three-way race in 1992, even though he dropped out in the middle of the summer and came back in. He got 19 million votes. That's a lot of votes from a third party. So I think there are so many billionaires around that
it'll happen.
There'll be a few that will just say enough is enough. I mean, Bloomberg toyed with it, but backed off.
Do you think John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi have more in common than most people suspect?
Yeah, they both centralized enormous power in their hands, even at the expense of what formerly were powerful chairs. The powers used to be in the hands of the chairperson of the Senate Commerce Committee or the House Ways and Means Committee. But now, in a often little catalog trend, it's in the hands of Boehner and Pelosi. I mean, I get people like Ed Markey, who used to be chair of the environment before he became a senator in the House of Representatives, and he would defer to Nancy Pelosi. Well, that never happened in the 60s or 70s, so that is not healthy at all. That's what gets this penalization of any dissent by any members of the two parties. They got to toe the line, and they got to head toward unanimous acclamation behind a particular bill or procedure.
We're seeing a concentration of power everywhere, and they become so good at manipulating the electorate. You have said that single-issue voters sell out too easy for their issue. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, they render themselves powerless except on that one issue. So if they go up to a politician who's, a town meeting, he's running, she's running, and basically they say, look, what's your position on reproductive rights, school prayer, flag desecration, gun control? And if the candidate agrees with the voter, that's all the voter wants. They're one issue. They don't care about anything else. They don't care about what Wall Street is doing to the country, bloated military budgets, restrictions on civil liberties of the Patriot Act, on and on. The tax code. And I've seen this all over the country. That's one reason why so many Democrats turned against me after 2000, because who were these Democrats? They were Democrats that were one-issue Democrats. Either it was all about abortion, or it was all about women's rights, or it was all about immigration, and they didn't care about anything else. So if you want to be more powerful as a voter, put 5, 6, 7, 8 issues before the political candidate who's trying to get your vote.
Makes sense. Let's get on to the war you've been fighting pretty much your whole adult life, the war against corporatism. Describe your enemy.
Corporatism is an operational political agenda, which basically says the country is better off if it's run by giant global corporations and their political allies in Washington or Albany or Boston or Sacramento. And it involves the merger of giant corporate power. We're not talking about Main Street small businesses here. Giant corporate power with government power in order to turn government essentially into either an accounts receivable for corporations, contracts, grants, giveaways, or a guarantor of giant corporate capitalism that becomes too big to fail. We've seen that with the big New York banks in the crash out of Wall Street in 2008, 2009. It wasn't enough that these speculative bosses were using other people's money, shredded trillions of dollars of pension money, mutual fund savings of people around the country, unemployed 8 million workers. They then boldly go to Washington and say, look, this whole country's economy can collapse. You got to bail us out. And Washington said, how much? Right away, sir. So that's what Franklin Delano Roosevelt called fascism.
Give us a little history lesson on the limited liability corporation under English and American law. And I don't mean the concept of personhood, but the separation of ownership and management.
Well, the modern corporation really started in the United States, at least in the very early 1800s in Massachusetts with the textile companies. And they would get a charter to open a textile factory, and they had to have it approved by the state legislature of Massachusetts. It wasn't some executive branch.
It's a state process. Corporations are chartered at the state level.
Yeah, and they were started only by special legislative enactment, one at a time. And they were chartered with a short lease. They would, for example, say you can be chartered for 10 years, you can have investors with limited liability, and we'll look at it 10 years hence to see whether you behaved yourself. So it was almost like a public standards charter. Well, it didn't take long before the corporation said, enough of this. We want to be free to do whatever we want. We want essentially a perpetual charter that is almost impossible to withhold or break. And so it was off to the races. In the 19th century, they broke one state restriction after another. They began to own other companies, not just textile companies. They began to cross-invest in each other. Later in the century, they developed holding companies where they created their own parents, all with limited liability to their investors.
When you say limited liability to an investor, you mean that shareholders are not held responsible for companies' transgressions and debts.
Yeah, only the extent of their investment. So if you had 100 shares and they were worth $5,000 and the company managers drove your company into bankruptcy, all you lose is $5,000.
Now, is that a bad thing? Is that something that we should get rid of?
Well, that really needs intricate discussion because right now what the corollary is, Bill, is that after the limited liability became quite mature, the next step was management stripping investors of any power to run themselves. They're hired hands at the top of the company. And so what happened was you had a complete reversal of a capitalist principle, which is if you own certain property, you should have some control over it.
But would the removal of the limitations on liability force shareholders to start paying attention?
Yes, most definitely.
So should I be exposed to personal bankruptcy by virtue of any stock I own in a corporation?
I'm not saying one way or the other. I haven't thought up the consequences of it, because I'll tell you one consequence. That if you are exposed to unlimited liability, you're going to demand a role as an investor in running the company. If you have limited liability, you will continue to be stripped of all authority. And so a few bosses at the top of ExxonMobil or Pfizer or Kennecott Copper basically make all the decisions under the so-called business judgment rule. They can even, in many cases, merge with other companies without even asking for shareholder authority.
But in return, if I don't like what they're doing, I just sell the stock.
That's right. That's what they tell you. If you don't like the way we've mismanaged your company, the way we've shredded 80% of your investment over time, get out. You can sell. That leaves the company in the hands of the rascals. So it's a double-edged sword where if they have unlimited liability, they're going to really want the investors of mutual funds, the pension funds that are the big holders of stock on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, they're going to want more power. Now, I think there's a middle ground there, which is to give considerable more authority to investors so that they can determine when to say no for excessive speculation like Citigroup and AIG, which ran the companies into bankruptcy, when they can say no to incredible executive compensation. You know, when I was a kid, the Fortune 300, the CEO got paid 12 to 14 times more than the entry-level worker, and it's now 300 to 500 times.
A lot of things have changed since you were a kid, Ralph. And in fact, in your book, you quote a lot of intellectuals from the 1930s. David Cushman Coyle, who favored direct corporate ownership over remote stock ownership, so it solves that problem. He said that if certain businesses required large-scale efficiencies, they should be run as public services. Do you agree with that?
Well, certainly the banks. I think the banks have got to, there's only 6 giant banks now in the country, and they control the bulk of the assets.
So they should be run as a public service.
As a public utility.
How about the phone company?
Yeah, because they're now reconsolidating from the old AT&T monopoly, which was broken up under the antitrust laws about 30-some years ago. Guess what? You know, it's down to AT&T and Verizon, and so there are certain guidelines that the Justice Department should put out. So when you cross those guidelines in terms of concentration ratios in the hands of a few giant corporations, they've got to be regulated.
So you agree with Henry Calver-Simmons' recommendation that federal law should limit the size of corporations?
I think so. It's more hard than what it was with Henry Simmons, who was one of the founders of the conservative Chicago School of Economics in 1930. But again, it's happening worldwide. Fewer and fewer giant corporations who would prefer to be stateless, who would prefer, to be a-national. But when they are chartered in the U.S., they've got to have some kind of accountability to U.S. law.
So Google and Amazon should be broken up.
Well, I think Google definitely. Amazon is a different cup of tea. I want to give it a few more years because Walmart and other giants now are going to go to same-day delivery. So let's see what happens there.
Troy Coley, another agrarianist you quote in your book, said that redistribution of income required a general diffusion of property ownership, that is, control over the sources of income. What did he mean by that?
These were the decentralists in the 1930s. I have a whole chapter in my book on this. They were quite remarkable. Their theory of power was that if you didn't have property, and they weren't just talking about land, they even talked about stock shares, and you didn't have control over what you own. Because now you have a split, as you mentioned earlier, between pension funds, individual investors, and mutual funds. They own stock, they own these big giant corporations, but they don't have the control. So there's a separation of control from ownership, and the bosses don't own, but they control the company. And so they were very sophisticated, these decentralists. They weren't tricked. They said, we not only want ownership of various kinds of property, and now they would have expanded into intellectual property, obviously. We want control. And that's the only way we're going to have power. And I think they defined power the way Marcus Cicero did over 2,000 years ago when he said, and he said it in reverse, he said, freedom is participation in power.
As companies get really large, should the government engage in widespread price controls?
No, I think I'd rather break them up under the antitrust laws, number one, so they have more competitors. Number two, I would use government procurement, because government, is the biggest consumer, to stimulate innovation. I mean, the government buys cars, they buy food, they buy energy, they buy paper, they buy things we don't buy, like missiles. So government procurement, the customer is always right, can generate more competition, more innovation. When the Navy bought photovoltaics many years ago, for economic reasons, not just environmental reasons, for remote locations run by the Navy, that expanded, could have stimulated the solar energy industry in the civilian arena much faster. So there are different ways to stimulate competition. The problem with price controls is that the corporate lawyers know how to game it.
When you talk about gaming the system, that gets into what used to be called regulatory capture. Describe that for us.
That's when the corporations actually want regulatory agencies to get rid of their competitors and to fix prices. And the early Interstate Commerce Commission, which came into being in the 1890s, the historical analysis of that is that the railroads really liked that. And later on, the trucking companies really liked that. And later on, the airlines in the late 1930s actually were right at the creation of the Civil Aeronautics Board, because what they did was they fixed prices. They had all kinds of complex tariffs, and this was called cartel pricing, and basically they excluded competitors. So for years, for example, there were no new airlines from 1938 until the late 70s. There were no new airlines, and so we opposed that.
That actually brings back memories of early in your career when you campaigned against regulatory capture hand in hand with Alfred Kahn, who was the famous guru of deregulation back in the 70s. I did a little research, and I see that Kahn was quoted as saying, "When Nader turned against deregulation, it broke my heart." And Kahn claims you put the interests of labor unions ahead of consumers. How would you respond to that?
Actually, I favored, and I testified, so it's a matter of record, I favored deregulation of trucking, railroads, and airlines. But I had two qualifications. One, that there had to be strong safety enforcement, because sometimes you get ruinous competition at the expense of dangers, of hazards to the passengers, etc. And the second, that the antitrust laws would be enforced. Well, when the airlines were deregulated, which is Alfred Kahn's contribution, in the following years, after they were deregulated in the 70s, 32 straight mergers between airlines were approved by the Department of Transportation. And so now we're down to, less than half a dozen airlines, fewer than when there was regulation under the CAB controlling a larger portion of the market.
Well, that could also be a statement of how scale industries work.
Well, not in the airlines. The one thing about the airlines is, you can start an airline, as has been started in Europe now, with just a few planes. And certainly Southwest Airlines started with a few planes. But it isn't just the planes, it's the slots. That is, if the airlines can control the slots at the airports, the major hub airports especially, and the large airports, that's the way they can keep out competitors.
You call for a greater public control of the public commons, like the airways or like slots in airport, and including the Internet. And I recall in the early 90s, you and your allies fought furiously against allowing commercial traffic on the Internet. I remember because I was on the other side of that fight. Do you still think it was a mistake to allow commercial traffic on the Internet?
I wasn't that deep into the Internet. I still use an Underwood typewriter, Bill. So I did want one thing, which was net neutrality. I did not want stratification, all the beginning of the thousands of different charges for different uses of the Internet. After all, it was funded by taxpayer money, the research and development of the Internet, and I like the idea of a common carrier, so that if I call you on the telephone today, it doesn't matter whether I'm a giant corporation calling you or I'm a day laborer, it's the same fare.
That's price control.
Well, in that sense it is, and that's what a common carrier is.
So you would like to run the Internet as a common carrier?
I would just like to run it with net neutrality, which is a form of price control, obviously. But it's open access, and of course, in the sense of the Internet, it's almost free.
When we look at regulatory capture and we look at big corporations gaming the system, do you make any distinction between what libertarians call crony capitalists and market capitalists, or do you see them all the same?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, crony capitalists control the terms of marketing. They use government power like cartel regulation. Crony capitalists also go to work on health and safety agencies. It's all we can do to keep the Food and Drug Administration and the Auto Safety Agency from being overpowered by lobbyists putting their own executives in government positions and funding campaigns of members of Congress who harass these agencies when they try to issue strong safety standards to protect the American people. So there is obviously a big difference between cartel economics and market economics, and you have to basically say, okay, the regulation should be for the benefit of the consumer. The regulation should be a benefit for the safety of the worker. The moment the regulation becomes for the benefit of the powerful employers and the vendors, then you got crony capitalism.
How can that possibly not happen under a duopoly system that we have of government?
It's hard to avoid it. That's why we have so much crony capitalism, and that's why we have guaranteed capitalism, which is a contradiction in terms, right? I mean, capitalism gets its ethical morality by sink or swim.
By failure.
If you don't meet the market, you sink. Well, now, if you're too big to fail, you go to Washington.
So wouldn't the solution be cutting off the ability of Washington to support companies?
Yeah, I mean, certainly to support their failures and to support their cartel structures and their joint ventures to keep innovation at bay and to keep competitors from moving in on them and taking market share. But there are other public purposes, like public works, like health and safety, air, water pollution control, etc., that constantly present a challenge. And some of the most pure market theorists over the last 200 years, including disciples of Ludwig von Mises, have stated that be very careful about not giving the market more burdens than it can handle. It's good at what it does. Another way of putting it is markets make good servants, but very bad masters.
Let's move on to the central thesis of your book, which is to convince libertarians to form an alliance with the progressive left. What's the goal of that alliance?
Victory. The goal is to have a better country. The goal is to, at the beginning, initiate redirections that are long overdue, supported by left-right. And I have in the book, I list them and then elaborate them on page 65, 66. There are at least 24 areas, and they're not trivial. 24 areas where there already is a left-right public opinion support. The challenge is to do what some have already done in terms of left-right alliances in passing bills in Congress like the Whistleblower Protection Act against corporate fraud on government, is to move this public sentiment, as Abraham Lincoln called it, into operational arenas, which mean elections or working on incumbents and getting on the media.
But this is on an issue-by-issue basis. You're not calling for a new party.
That's right. Issue-by-issue basis. See, I think that once the left-right alliance manifests itself with a roar toward Washington from the West Coast, and whether it's in the form of emails or other forms of demonstrative registering of opinion, you can change incumbents. You don't even have to work on elections. I've seen it happen. I mean, when the FCC put their media concentration rule into effect, the roar from people who are members of NRA and Common Cause onto the House of Representatives, unheard of, 390 votes came in out of 435 to overturn the rule, challenging big media itself. And it would have gone right through the Senate, except that the Senate is a graveyard of democracy, and they delayed it enough so the steam fell out of the effort. It was such an unorganized roar or rumble from the people. But again, I've seen it defeat the breeder reactor in Tennessee, left-right, against the lobbying of General Electric and Ronald Reagan. That was a huge corporate welfare boondoggle in 1983. I've seen it get the False Claims Act through against corporate lobbyists in 1986. I saw it more recently block the plunge to war in Syria. I've seen it almost defy Boehner and Pelosi by rank-and-file Republicans and Democrats to stop the NSA from their dragnet snooping on the American people. So there are a lot of examples, and this book tries to tie these things together and provide a huge morale boost for the American people who are pretty discouraged about getting anything done for the public well-being.
You know, you talk about the long march toward prudent economic self-reliance. What is economic self-reliance?
That's my favorite. It's basically, I suppose it's Main Street, not Wall Street. I suppose it's small business, not global business. It has no allegiance to our country other than to control it and ship its jobs and industries to fascist and communist regimes who know how to keep their 80 cents an hour indentured workers in place and ship the products back. So I favor, for example, the extent we can generate our own local energy, especially renewables and energy efficiency. Solar panels are sprouting out on roofs all over California and other states. It's going to be a major industry. The price of solar panels is dropping. I like the idea of farmer to consumer
the price of solar panels is dropping because the Chinese are making so many of them.
No, this is some benefit from that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Then the same thing with credit unions and small community banks. I think they're more accountable and more interested in the local community. I like community health clinics that focus on prevention, good diet, good exercise, not just treatment, instead of going through day after day, making money for Pfizer or Merck with more and more medication. or these giant hospital chains that are gouging the taxpayer to perdition.
You're basically making war on scale.
Yeah. And the nice thing about this bill is if you take old tested knowledge and you take a lot of the traditions of local people and you apply appropriate new technologies like the internet, like renewable energy, it's a great combination for progress.
But the only way I can be talking to you right now over all this digital equipment is because of scale. There's no way you could run a memory plant without scale, a microprocessor plant without scale, or in fact, a car company without scale gets challenging. I know they're trying it out in California, but that's with a lot of government subsidies. Certain businesses require scale if products can get cheap enough for all consumers. Doesn't the consumer benefit in the end by cheaper products?
Especially if they have entry as small business. And the nice thing about it is that as automation increased in the auto industry, the scale went down. It used to be so you have to have all kinds of vertical integration,